Zelensky's attempt to reinvigorate the peace process was in evidence on Monday, the 9th of December, during his summit in Paris with the so-called Normandy format, which includes France, Germany, Russia, and Ukraine. This was the first time the Normandy format had met since October 2016. Poroshenko had given up on trying to kind of have a breakthrough, but the youthful and more arrogant Volodymyr Zelensky had, on the one hand, with a new presidency, he wanted to prove that he could reach peace, and secondly, he wanted to show that he was somehow better than Poroshenko in being able to achieve that peace. A few months ago, he was extremely naive about the whole process, also had very little experience of international affairs. A bit of a wake-up call for him, or a big wake-up call for him, were the protests throughout Ukraine. And being a sort of an anti-establishment populist, he's very much in tune with public opinion polls. Ukrainians are not Russians. They withdraw their support for politicians quite quickly if they don't really meet their demands. So when the protests happened, he was surprised. I wasn't, because unlike him, I'd been following opinion polls in Ukraine for the last 5 years. And what was evident was that there was extreme caution in Ukraine about any peace dealings with Putin. Putin has had negative rankings of 70 to 80% in Ukraine for the last 5 or 6 years, and these have been consistent. It's no longer just West Ukrainians. This is a broader across the board. And the no to capitulation movement, again, wasn't just a Western Ukrainian phenomena. I was in Dnipro, formerly Dnipropetrovsk, about 3 weeks ago, and there's an anti-capitulation headquarters in that city as well. A city in an oblast, Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, which has suffered the most, the highest number of casualties of Ukrainian soldiers in the war. So that was not surprising to me, but it was surprising to Zelensky. It was a wake-up call, and hence he became tougher in the negotiations with Russia at the Normandy format. Initially, when Zelensky raised the idea of reviving the Normandy format, Putin and Russian leaders were very hopeful that Zelensky was going to basically give them everything that they demanded. And at the beginning, that seemed to be the case back in October. But things have changed. Things have moved on. Zelensky's got a bit more of a spine. Maybe he's a bit more knowledgeable. So what came out of the Normandy format was not very much, which is not surprising to those who have been following the whole peace process and the war in Ukraine. Yes, there will be, or they're supposed to be, by the end of this year, an exchange of prisoners. Now, this is, of course, great. People can come home before the new year. But let's remember what we're talking about here. We're talking about bona fide terrorists convicted in Ukraine, or Russian soldiers who were being captured in Ukraine, who are in Ukrainian prisons, not people who are on trumped-up charges, bona fide terrorists and soldiers illegally fighting in Ukraine. And on the other hand, Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars imprisoned in Russia or in the Crimea, who have been sentenced on trumped-up charges, like the Russian film director from the Crimea, Sentsov. So it's an exchange of prisoners doesn't really describe exactly what this really refers to, because it refers to innocent people being exchanged for bona fide terrorists. So it's not terrorists for terrorists, as it were. They're also talking about opening up more kind of entry points on the contact line, so people can cross the contact line and to meet relatives, to do shopping, to undertake collection of pensions and such like, and maybe the withdrawal again of Ukrainian forces from a further 3, Already there have been 3, a further 3 making 6 military points along the contact line. So these are small, maybe potentially elements of progress, but that's it. And the reason why that's it is because Russia's position hasn't changed. Russia's position hasn't tried to moderate itself in the hope of trying to do some kind of good compromise with Zelensky, who maybe would be more open to compromise than previously Poroshenko. Instead, Russia's kept up its hardline position, and the core of that hardline position is to transform its separatist regions, the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, into basically a Russian Trojan horse inside Ukraine, which would be funded by Ukraine, with the rebuilding of the region funded by Ukraine, not Russia, and where this special status new region would be de facto controlled by Russia, but would have a veto over Ukrainian domestic and foreign policy. Simply, that would be unacceptable to majority of Ukrainian public opinion. Something like 2/3 of Ukrainians want the Donbas, Donetsk and Luhansk to return to Ukraine in the same position, as it were, as they had prior to 2014. That is, no autonomy at all. That's 2/3. The idea that Zelensky, even if he wanted to, and I don't think he does, would go for this kind of Russian Trojan horse is simply preposterous. And even if he tried to push that through parliament, there will probably be a rebellion in his own faction, and there certainly would be mass riots outside the Ukrainian parliament, as there were in late August of 2015, when they also were then discussing the concept of special status and changing the constitution. So it's a non-starter, that. And many Ukrainian diplomats have talked about there is no need for a special status because Ukraine's very successful decentralization process, which has been happening since 2015, is sufficient to allow enough devolution to the regions, including these separatist regions, for them to control their local affairs. So now another reason why Putin is pushing this is because of Russian nationalist and Putin's stereotypes and misconceptions about Ukraine, which are not going to go away in the near future. And those are that this is a civil war between Ukrainian and Russian speakers, that if Ukrainian forces come and retake over these regions, the DNR and LNR, that there will be a bloodshed. He's compared it to a bloodshed that took place in Srebrenica when Serbian forces massacred 6,000 Bosnian men and young boys. This is preposterous. It's preposterous because Russian speakers are not oppressed in Ukraine. There's not a single opinion poll in Ukraine that shows Russian speakers as being oppressed. When this question is asked in opinion polls about, have you seen some discrimination of Russian speakers, the maximum that usually is received is about 5% of people who said they've heard or seen something like that. 5%. That's probably less than you'll get from English speakers living in Quebec. So the idea, or French speakers living in Flanders in Belgium. So the idea that somehow there's a repression of Russian speakers in Ukraine is ridiculous. It's not simply true. And it's actually a major gaffe on the part of Zelensky that at the final press conference, when Putin raised this question of repression of Russian speakers in Ukraine, Zelensky didn't say anything. Why did he not respond and say, hold on, this is not true, and you should look at your own repression of Ukrainians in the Russian Federation. Ukrainians in the Russian Federation are the second largest minority after Tatars. They have 0 schools, 0 educational or media facilities, and all Ukrainian churches are banned. That is also the case in the Crimea and in the DNR, LNR. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which is controlled by the Russian Patriarch, Kate, still has a legal status in Ukraine. It's not banned. So the idea that somehow everything is bad in Ukraine, everything's rosy in Russia, is simply not true, but it's a myth and stereotype propounded by Putin. And it's back to his question of that somehow there's a civil war taking place, which again is at odds with the fact that a huge number of the soldiers fighting for Ukraine are Russian speakers. How can this be a civil war if, I don't know, according to Poroshenko, it was 60% of Ukrainian soldiers are Russian speakers. And I've seen that myself in a visit to the front line in June of this year. How is it possible that it's a civil war when Dnipropetrovsk has the highest rate of casualties of Ukrainian soldiers in Ukraine? So it's not true, but if Putin believes that, then he's not going to allow, firstly, Ukraine to retake control of the border. He's rejected that today because he then believes that Russia could no longer provide this kind of guarantee to prevent a massacre, as he called it, of Russian speakers in the DNR, LNR. And if there's no control of borders, then you can't have any Ukrainian security presence or any political advancement in those regions. You can't hold free elections, as Zelensky's been talking about, in those separatist regions if you don't control the border, because then anything can come over the border. Fake voters, weapons, you name it. So it's simply a no-go. If Russia is unwilling to give back control of the border to Ukraine because it supposedly fears a Srebrenica on the part of Ukraine in the DNR and LNR, then it's a non-starter because that's a key question of the return of Ukraine's sovereignty over those regions. And the other problem that really hasn't been talked about, it's just kind of mentioned without really any deep thought, is the whole question of demilitarization. What does that actually mean? It sounds very easy when people just talk about it like that. And Zelensky's talked about these separatist regions taking part in nationwide local elections in October of 2020. That's simply not going to happen. How can you demilitarize 35,000 separatist army within 10 months? Forget it. It's not going to happen. It took many, many years to demilitarize 2,000 terrorists in Northern Ireland, and they only had Kalashnikovs, small arms. This is an army of 35,000 which has tanks, armored personnel carriers, surface-to-air missiles, everything. How are you going to do that? It's going to be impossible. And then what do you do with all this military equipment? Zelensky says send it back to Russia. But Russia says it's a civil war. It's nothing to do with Russia. If Russia accepts this military equipment back, then it's also basically admitted that it gave this military equipment to the separatists, and that this is not a civil war. It's the same reason why Russia cannot admit the shooting down of MH17, because if it did, then it would have admitted to illegally providing weaponry to the separatists to shoot down this aircraft. So again, that's not going to happen. And then you have, on top of that, you have the problem of Russian forces in Ukraine. Putin has always denied this from day one. Of course, Zelensky talks about foreign forces. Well, foreign forces are Russian forces. There are estimates of anything between 5,000 to 10,000 Russian forces, military, FSB, and GRU forces in Ukraine. If a demilitarization were to begin to happen, I guarantee you that these 5,000 to 10,000 Russians would suddenly become locals. they would don separatist uniforms and pretend to be from the Donbas, thereby increasing the number of forces that need to be demilitarized from 35 to 40 or 45,000. They certainly wouldn't return to Russia. And Russia, especially because Russia is saying this is a civil war, we're not even involved in this conflict. It's not only that Russia said it's not involved in the conflict, but Russia says that the Crimea, which Zelensky wanted to raise at the Normandy format, Russia's again reminded him that Crimea is not up for negotiation. So if it took such a long period of time in Northern Ireland for demilitarization of a small group of people, in the case of Ukraine, it's going to take even longer. Another question which has been raised, again by Putin, is the need for some kind of amnesty. Well, again, you're not going to do an amnesty process within 10 months. But even if you tried, remember that 2/3 of Ukrainians are opposed to giving an amnesty. So this will be highly unpopular because two-thirds or more of Ukrainians look upon these forces from the DNR and LNR as terrorists. But nevertheless, let's look at the South African equivalent, which was the Truth Commission in South Africa, which dealt with crimes and various crimes against humanity, war crimes committed under the apartheid regime. This was a process that took years to implement in a system which had a kind of a judicial system inherited from Britain, which could actually implement it. In the case of Ukraine, how do you separate the officials in the DNR and LNR and the soldiers in the DNR and LNR who have committed crimes from those that haven't? Zelensky talks about giving amnesty only to those who haven't committed crimes. How do you find out which ones have and which ones haven't? Ukraine's judicial system is useless. We have the Gongadze case, which took place in 2000, nearly 20 years ago, is still unresolved. Yushchenko's poisoning, which took place in 2004, 15 years ago, is still unresolved. The Euromaidan killings, which took place 5-6 years ago, are still unresolved. Nobody has gone to jail, really, from the senior levels who implemented the massacre of 100 protesters. So the idea that Ukraine's judicial system could sort out who is guilty of crimes and who isn't, and who should be amnestied, again, is a pipe dream. And from that point of view, I think that what we have seen from the Normandy format is that there is no way forward to resolve this deadlock. Because we're back to, in many ways, the same problems we had under Poroshenko. What steps do you take first? Do you take security steps first, which is the Ukrainian position, returning the border, demilitarization, then political steps, elections and constitutional changes, or the Russian position, which is forget the political is important, security is later on. But then you'd have to trust the Russians, trust Putin to agree to give back the border and agree to demilitarize after you've gone ahead with local elections. The majority of Ukrainians, again, we're talking 2/3 to something like 70% of Ukrainians, only want to have elections held in these two separatist regions when they are controlled by Ukraine, not when they're controlled just by the separatists. Now, what does that mean? It means that you have weapons taken off the streets, that all Ukrainian political parties have an ability to take part, and that the OSCE can come in and ensure that you have a free election. That's not going to happen if you have 35,000 separatists walking around with heavy weaponry. So again, I don't think that's likely. I mean, the crux of the problem that we have, and I think Zelensky may eventually get there. Maybe it took, he is from Russian-speaking Eastern Ukraine, so he doesn't necessarily reach his conclusion as quick as those of us who have origins in Western Ukraine, and that is that you're dealing with a country, Russia, that doesn't respect your sovereignty, that thinks Ukrainians are fake news, and thinks that Ukraine should be under Russia's thumb. That's the crux of the matter. And the way Russia sees it can bring Ukraine back is having that Trojan horse as the DNR LNR, the Trojan horse that it controls inside Ukraine, vetoing Ukrainian domestic and foreign policy. As nobody in Kiev is unlikely to go for that, then I just don't see how a breakthrough can happen. And even if it was to happen, it would take years for questions of amnesty, demilitarization, this and that. It would certainly take up the whole of Zelensky's first term in office. It's not going to happen. And therefore, because it's not going to happen, the Normandy format on Monday showed, I think, that we have reached what some in the Zelensky team have talked about already, Plan B or Plan C, which is basically we're moving towards a frozen conflict, which the Ukrainian side accepts that there isn't really a resolution to this conflict. As currently as it stands with the people in power in Moscow. And what that holds, that means that, well, in the Ukrainian case, some people like Mr. Yermak, who was Zelensky's senior foreign policy advisor, has even talked about building an Israeli-style wall to separate the contact line new border de facto from the separatist regions and from Russia. That seems to be where we are moving. We're moving more in that direction rather than in the direction of trying to have a breakthrough with a new peace agreement. So those commentators who jumped up in the air after Monday's Normandy Four Summit and believe that things are moving forward are, I think, extremely wrong here on this question. Because on the one hand, we had Zelensky, who showed a stiffer spine. He was forced to become tougher in his negotiations. And on the other, you have a Russia which refuses to have any sort of moderation or any attempt at compromise. And because of that, a breakthrough peace agreement is not going to happen. So, unfortunately, that's where we are heading. 2020 will be the beginning of what will become de facto a new frozen conflict in the Donbas region. Thank you.